They fired me for being redundant. A week later, they realized I was the only one who legally held the company's operating license. Please stay with me as I tell you my story, and please do not forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones. My name is Michael Harris, I'm 38, and I live in Ohio. For over 11 years, I worked at a mid-sized construction company called Riverside Builds Incorporated. It wasn't just a job to me, it was my life. I poured everything I had into that place. I worked weekends when no one else would. I stayed late to make sure projects got done on time, and I saved the company money more times than I can count by cutting waste and finding smarter ways to work. I didn't just care about myself. I mentored the younger guys who came in, teaching them how to do things right, making sure they felt like they belonged. Back then, I believed loyalty mattered. I thought if I gave the company my best, they'd give me the same in return. But things started changing when new leadership came in. My old manager, Daniel, had always been fair with me, but he wasn't the one calling the shots anymore. The new COO, Rebecca, was different. She didn't care about the people who had built the company up. To her, we were just numbers on a spreadsheet, costs to be cut, and nothing more. I started to notice small things at first. Her ignoring my suggestions in meetings, brushing off the value of my experience, acting like the younger, flashier employees were the future while I was just a leftover from the past. People whispered about changes coming, and though I tried to ignore it, I had a sinking feeling in my gut. I could see the arrogance creeping in, decisions being made not to help the company grow, but to make Rebecca look good to the investors. I never imagined, after more than a decade of loyalty, that I'd be the one on the chopping block. But betrayal has a way of sneaking up on you, and I was about to find out just how disposable I really was in their eyes. Even when the company went through rough patches, I stayed. When the economy dipped and jobs dried up, Riverside Builds cut staff, tightened belts, and prayed for contracts to keep rolling in. A lot of people jumped ship during those years, chasing stability somewhere else, but I held my ground. I told myself loyalty mattered, that if I kept showing up and giving my best, eventually it would pay off. I watched coworkers get laid off, saw friends pack their desks, and I stayed behind, covering twice the work so the company could survive. Daniel Price, my direct manager, always seemed to notice. He wasn't a bad guy, he was supportive in his own way. He'd pat me on the back after a long week and tell me he didn't know how the team would hold together without me. But Daniel was never the type to fight hard battles. He played it safe, went along with whatever the higher-ups wanted, and made sure he wasn't the one rocking the boat. I respected him, but I also knew if push came to shove, he wouldn't be able to protect me. The real shift happened when Rebecca Clark came in as the new COO. She had this sharp, polished presence, the kind of person who could smile while cutting your legs out from under you. Right away, she started making changes, trimming budgets, boasting about efficiency and profitability. Investors loved her for it, but the people inside the company felt the chill. She didn't care about experience or loyalty, she cared about numbers. It didn't take long before I realized how she saw me. In meetings, she'd glance at me like I was from another era, like I was a leftover piece of furniture taking up space. I'd suggest ideas based on years of doing the work, and she'd brush them aside as if they didn't matter. More than once, I caught her praising newer employees for things I had already done countless times. It was clear she wanted younger, flashier people she could mold, not someone like me who had been there too long to be impressed by her corporate tricks. Around the office, whispers started floating. Casual remarks about cost-cutting or streamlining staff. One afternoon, I overheard two supervisors talking in the hallway, lowering their voices when I walked by. I wasn't paranoid. I knew the look of people who were already planning a future without me in it. Even then, I tried to hold on. I reminded myself of the years I had put in, of all the storms I had weathered for the company. I told myself Rebecca didn't understand the history, that maybe she would come to see my value eventually. But deep down, I could feel something shifting. The ground I had stood on for over a decade wasn't steady anymore, and for the first time, I started to wonder if my loyalty was going to be my downfall. The call came out of nowhere. Mid-morning, an email from HR landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Meeting request." No explanation, just a time and a conference room number. My stomach twisted as soon as I saw it. I'd been around long enough to know what those sudden, vague invitations usually meant, but I still tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a routine check-in. Maybe a benefits update. I walked down the hallway with a knot in my throat, forcing myself to breathe steadily. The conference room was too bright, the blinds pulled open so the winter sun poured in like a spotlight. Rebecca was already sitting at the table, perfectly composed, her blazer pressed, her expression unreadable. Across from her sat the HR manager, a woman I'd barely spoken to before. The atmosphere was stiff, scripted, like I'd stepped into a play where everyone had rehearsed their lines except me. Rebecca wasted no time. "Michael," she said, her voice sharp but calm, "the company has been reviewing its structure. Unfortunately, your role has been deemed redundant." Redundant. The word hit me like a slap. My mouth went dry, my pulse pounded in my ears. For 11 years I'd been the one staying late, holding things together, and now I was nothing more than an extra part they didn't need. I sat frozen, unable to process it. The HR manager slid a folder across the table. "This is your severance package," she said in a rehearsed monotone. "You'll have until the end of the day to clear your belongings. Your company email will be deactivated within 24 hours. End of the day." That was it. Just like that, I was disposable. No warning, no conversation, not even a word of thanks for everything I had given. I wanted to ask how they could do this, to demand an explanation, but my voice wouldn't come out. Rebecca avoided eye contact, glancing instead at her phone as if the meeting were already over. I left the room carrying that folder like it was a death notice. Walking through the office, I felt eyes on me. Some people looked away quickly. Others gave me sympathetic glances, but no one spoke. I made it out the doors without a word, each step heavier than the last. When I got to my truck, I sat behind the wheel and just stared at my hands. They were trembling so badly, I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong, how I could work myself raw for more than a decade and still end up tossed out like garbage. The anger didn't come all at once. It started as a dull ache in my chest, growing hotter every time I replayed the word Rebecca used. Redundant. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I sat in silence, staring through the windshield, until the anger started to rise. I might have left quietly, but something inside me was already burning. That night, after the shock wore off enough for me to move again, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by boxes I'd carried out of the office. The folder HR gave me was still unopened on the counter, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I started going through the pile of papers I had collected over the years, training certificates, project binders, renewal forms. Most of it was routine, the kind of documentation you keep just in case, but one file caught my attention. It was a thick envelope marked with the state seal. I pulled it out, curious, and when I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightened. It wasn't just paperwork, it was the paperwork. The official construction operating license issued by the state of Ohio. The kind every company in the business needed if they wanted to bid, secure contracts, or even keep projects moving. The detail hit me like a spark in the dark. The license wasn't under Riverside Builds Incorporated. It was under my name. Years ago, when the company first applied, they'd needed someone qualified to hold it. I'd been the one with the experience, the certifications, and the clean record to make it possible. Back then, I'd signed the forms without thinking twice. To me, it was just another responsibility, another way I could help the company succeed. No one had ever suggested transferring it, and I'd never thought it mattered. Until now. As I sat there, the memory of Rebecca flashed in my mind. Months earlier, during a meeting, I had tried to explain the importance of staying current with licensing requirements. She had waved her hand dismissively and said, "That's just paperwork, Michael. Not worth worrying about." I remembered how her tone had grated on me, how she acted like years of compliance and state inspections were trivial. Now, that paperwork was the one thing standing between Riverside and their ability to operate. I leaned back in my chair and let out a dry laugh. They had cut me off in a single day, confident they didn't need me, and yet here was the truth staring me in the face. They couldn't even legally sign a contract without my name attached to it. The bitterness I had been carrying since the HR meeting began to twist into something sharper. For the first time since walking out of that office, I didn't feel powerless. I felt steady. The kind of steady you get when the balance shifts in your favor. I set the license paperwork down carefully, almost reverently, and let a smirk pull at the corner of my mouth. They thought I was redundant. They thought they could erase me without consequence. But this piece of paper said otherwise. For the first time in days, I felt the heat of anger cool into something far more dangerous, leverage. About a week after I was pushed out, My phone buzzed with a message from an old coworker. At first, I ignored it, figuring it was just a friendly check-in, maybe someone feeling bad about how things ended. But when I finally opened it, the tone was different. "You won't believe what's going on here. Total chaos." I called him back, and that's when the story spilled out. Riverside had tried to move forward on 2 new contracts, both of them lucrative jobs that Rebecca had bragged about landing. The problem was, when they submitted the paperwork, the state board kicked it back. Without a valid operating license, nothing could go through. The deals stalled before they even began. Clients were furious, investors were starting to ask questions, and inside the office, panic had set in. I listened quietly, hiding the small grin tugging at my mouth. It was the first crack in the armor, the first sign that what they thought was a clean break wasn't going to be so clean after all. My coworker went on, describing how Rebecca was storming through the halls, snapping at anyone who dared to ask what was happening. Meetings were being called daily, and each one ended with fewer answers than the last. It wasn't just about those 2 deals, either. Without a valid license, Riverside couldn't touch any new projects. Everything had to be put on hold. Construction timelines froze, subcontractors sat idle, and clients who had already sunk money into early stages of work began threatening lawsuits. The phones rang off the hook with complaints. What had once been a busy, functioning operation was grinding to a halt right before their eyes. The more I heard, the clearer it became. Rebecca had no idea what she was dealing with. She thought she could muscle through on confidence and charm, but the state didn't care about either. Without the proper paperwork, Riverside wasn't just stalled, it was paralyzed. By the end of the week, whispers reached me from multiple people. Some were angry, some amused, but they all painted the same picture. The company that had thrown me out like yesterday's trash was now in freefall, and no one inside knew how to stop it. Late one evening, I let my voicemail play while I cooked dinner. That's when I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Daniel." His words tumbled out, rushed and uneven, nothing like the calm, cautious man I'd worked under for years. "Mike, we need to talk. It's urgent. Call me back as soon as you can." I stood there with the phone in my hand, the smell of dinner on the stove fading into the background. Urgent. The word lingered. For the first time since leaving that office, it was them chasing me, not the other way around. The following afternoon, I got a text from Daniel asking if I could meet him. He didn't sound like himself, short sentences, no small talk, just a time and place. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We ended up at a small diner off the highway, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never ran dry. I slid into the seat across from him, and was struck by how different he looked. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie hung loose, and sweat glistened on his forehead, even though the air conditioning was blasting. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mike," he started, his voice low, "we made a mistake. A big one." He ran a hand through his thinning hair and leaned across the table. "The operating license, it's in your name. We can't move a single contract forward without it." I didn't say a word. I just stirred the coffee in front of me and let him talk. He shifted uncomfortably under the silence. "We need you to transfer it back to the company," he said finally, his voice cracking a little. "Rebecca, she didn't realize. None of us did. Look, without that license, we're dead in the water. The clients are threatening to walk, investors are furious, and jobs are on the line." I let the words hang in the air for a long moment before speaking. Why should I help the people who toss me out like trash? My tone was calm, but every syllable carried the weight of what I'd been holding in since that HR meeting. Daniel's eyes darted around the diner, as if someone might be listening. He leaned closer, desperation plain in his face. "It's not about Rebecca. It's about the workers. The crews, the office staff, families depend on those paychecks. If Riverside folds, they'll all suffer." I studied him, taking in the way his hands trembled against the tabletop. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him. He wasn't the one who had shoved me out the door. He was just too weak to stop it. Still, I couldn't ignore the memory of that cold conference room, Rebecca's dismissive tone, the way no one had spoken up for me. "Funny," I said quietly. "Rebecca didn't think of me, did she?" The words landed between us like a stone. Daniel flinched, but he didn't argue. He knew I was right. He pressed his palms together as though he was praying, but I stayed still, letting him sit in the silence he had helped create. The waitress came by and refilled our coffees, oblivious to the storm brewing in that booth. Daniel muttered another plea, but I didn't answer. I just leaned back, watching him sweat, and let the balance of power shift where it belonged. It was only a matter of time before Rebecca reached out herself. The call came late in the evening, her number flashing across my phone like a warning sign. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, but curiosity won. I answered, and her voice came through tight, polished, but carrying a strain she couldn't quite mask. "Michael," she said, her tone clipped but artificially pleasant. "We need to resolve this situation. I think you'll find we can come to an arrangement that benefits both of us." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang. Her choice of language almost made me laugh. An arrangement. What she meant was, we're desperate and you hold all the cards. She launched into her pitch, smooth as glass. "They could bring me back as a consultant," she said. "I wouldn't need to come into the office, just lend my name and signature. In return, they'd pay me generously, more than I'd been making before." It was meant to sound enticing, a way for me to save face while still helping them. But underneath that polished delivery, I heard the grit of frustration grinding through her teeth. She hated that she had to call me, hated that she was in this position. And the more she talked, the more I realized just how completely the roles had flipped. "I'm not interested," I said finally, keeping my voice even. There was a pause, just long enough for me to imagine her jaw tightening. "Michael, be reasonable. This benefits everyone. You'll be compensated, and the company can move forward." "Reasonable?" I said, almost amused. "You fired me without warning. You called me redundant. And now you want me to bail you out? No thanks." The mask slipped then. Her tone hardened, the forced politeness cracking. "If you refuse, we'll pursue legal avenues. You can't just hold the company hostage." That was the moment I felt the full weight of my position settle in. I wasn't the one on shaky ground, she was. I knew the law, knew the license was issued to me as an individual. They couldn't take it, couldn't force me to hand it over. For the first time since walking out of that building, I felt untouchable. "Try whatever you like," I said calmly. "The state board will back me. Good luck explaining to your investors why your COO let this happen." Her sharp inhale came through the line, followed by silence. I pictured her sitting in her office, nails digging into her desk, realizing there was no quick fix this time. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to gloat. The quiet certainty in my voice was enough. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly, a sense of steady satisfaction rising in me. They had thrown me away like I was nothing. Now, without me, they were nothing. News of Riverside's downfall reached me piece by piece, like fragments of a story I already knew the ending to. First came a message from one of the guys I used to supervise. He told me the company had just lost a huge contract, one Rebecca had bragged would secure their future for the next 2 years. The client pulled out after learning Riverside didn't have the proper credentials to move forward. That one loss alone cost them millions, but it didn't stop there. Word spread quickly in the industry, and soon every prospective partner was backing away. No one wanted to risk signing on with a company that couldn't even prove it was legally able to work. Contracts that had once been celebrated as victories evaporated overnight. The crews sat idle, waiting for assignments that never came. Payroll became delayed. Rumors of layoffs filled the hallways. For the first time in over a decade, Riverside wasn't the busy, bustling company I had once known. It was a sinking ship. Employees began to walk out. Some couldn't handle the uncertainty, while others were furious about how management had let things spiral out of control. A few of them called me directly, venting about the chaos. They told me about tense staff meetings where Rebecca snapped at anyone who questioned her, about Daniel looking more and more like a man carrying the weight of failure on his shoulders. Morale collapsed just as quickly as the contracts. Then came the investors. Once they caught wind of the compliance disaster, funding started drying up. Deals that had been signed in good faith were suddenly pulled. Some investors threatened lawsuits, others simply cut ties. Without their backing, Riverside had no cushion to absorb the blows. Bills stacked up, projects stalled indefinitely, and the company's reputation, once steady, was now mud. I wasn't surprised to hear that Daniel eventually stepped down. It wasn't in his nature to fight, and I imagine the shame of watching the company crumble under his watch was too much. As for Rebecca, the industry that had once applauded her bold leadership turned on her. Word traveled fast that her arrogance had blinded her to the basics. Her career wasn't just bruised, it was shattered. The last update I got came from a friend still clinging to his job. His voice over the phone carried a mix of disbelief and bitterness. "Mike, the place is a ghost town now. Empty desks, phones that don't ring, trucks sitting in the lot collecting dust." Hearing those words, I felt a swell of conflicting emotions. Vindication, yes, I won't deny it. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. But beneath the satisfaction, there was a quiet ache for the workers who had been caught in the crossfire. The men and women who had shown up every day, just like I had, only to watch everything they'd built crumble because of someone else's pride. Once Riverside's collapse was all but certain, I started getting calls. This time, not from desperate managers or panicked coworkers, but from competitors. Word had spread quickly about what happened, and somehow, the story of me holding the license in my own name made the rounds in the construction circles of Ohio. Companies that had once been rivals now saw me as someone worth having on their side. At first, I was cautious. After what I had been through, I wasn't eager to jump back into another corporate machine that might treat me like a disposable part. But as I listened to their offers, I could tell the tone was different. These weren't recruiters throwing out empty promises. These were owners and managers speaking directly to me, telling me they'd heard about my reputation, my reliability, the years I had put in. For the first time in a long time, I felt wanted. One offer stood out. It wasn't the biggest company, or the one with the fattest paycheck. It was a family-owned firm out of Columbus, run by two brothers who had taken over from their father. When I met them in person, they didn't talk about profits or investors first. They talked about people, about the crews they kept on year after year, about how their foremen were like extended family. Sitting across from them in their modest office, I realized this was what I'd been missing. Respect. Stability. A place where loyalty still meant something. I accepted their offer, and within weeks I was back on job sites, but this time the atmosphere was different. No one dismissed me as old school. No one brushed off my experience. Instead, they leaned on it. Younger workers asked for advice and listened carefully when I gave it. The owners thanked me personally whenever I went the extra mile. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore, waiting for someone to decide I didn't fit their image. One afternoon, after a long day overseeing a project, the older of the two brothers clapped me on the shoulder and said with a grin, "Michael, I'll tell you right now, you're not redundant. You're essential." The words landed heavier than he probably realized. Simple, genuine, without any agenda. And in that moment, something inside me eased that I hadn't even noticed was still tight. I went home that night with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The bitterness I'd carried after Riverside had been replaced by something quieter, steadier. I wasn't just rebuilding a career, I was rebuilding myself. I was no longer the man sitting in a parking lot questioning his worth. I was standing again solid, respected, and whole. Looking back now, it's almost strange to think how blind I was. For so many years, I believed loyalty was a shield, that if I gave everything I had to a company, it would protect me in return. I thought hard work spoke for itself. I thought dedication was unshakable currency. What I learned is that blind loyalty can make you an easy target. The moment someone in power decides you don't fit their picture, all the late nights and weekends, all the sacrifices, vanish like they never happened. That betrayal cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about realizing I had been invisible to the people I trusted most in that place. They didn't see the years, the sweat, the sleepless nights. They saw a line item to erase. The sting of that realization will never fully leave me. And yet, there was a strange kind of justice in what followed. They had tried to erase me, but in doing so, they exposed how much they had depended on me all along. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to scheme or plot. All I had to do was stand still, and the truth unraveled around them. That truth was sharper than any revenge I could have planned. But if I'm honest, it wasn't just satisfaction I felt. It was clarity. The anger fueled me at first, but over time, what stayed was the understanding that respect, real respect, is worth more than a paycheck or a title. Without it, you're just a tool waiting to be tossed aside. With it, you're a person valued and seen. I've learned that protecting your self-respect has to come before protecting any job. Companies will make promises, managers will smile and tell you you're important. But at the end of the day, you can't hand them the keys to your worth. That belongs to you and only you. I carry that lesson with me now. I no longer measure my value by how much I sacrifice for someone else's bottom line. I measure it by the respect I receive and the pride I take in myself. That shift has changed everything. How I work, how I live, even how I see the people around me. When I think back to that cold conference room, to Rebecca's dismissive tone and that one brutal word, redundant, I almost smile. Because in the end, she couldn't have been more wrong. They called me redundant. But in the end, I was the one thing they could never replace.